Good afternoon, everyone. There's still a few people joining us, but I'd like to kick off this afternoon's webinar and welcome you to the first of the West Australian Biodiversity Science Institute's regular, from this one, series on big issues in biodiversity science. In opening the meeting today, or the webinar today, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners of the land that we are based on here in Perth in Western Australia, the Noongar Nation. Paying respects to elders past, present and emerging is something that our Australian participants will be very familiar with, but I know we have some international participants in today's meeting, and it's an important part of our acknowledgement here as settlers in the traditional countries of the Aboriginal Australians, that we do pay our respects to them as traditional owners, and particularly for those of us working in biodiversity and conservation, acknowledge the traditional ways that this land has been kept and maintained in the past, and try and benefit from the best of that wisdom integrated with Western science going forward. So an important part of the opening of all of our meetings and formal events is to acknowledge those traditional owners, and I do pay respect to traditional owners who may be with us and traditional owners of the lands where you are today. I'd also like to thank the University of Western Australia for kindly making their Zoom facilities available to us to run today's event. Today we are talking about restoration and rewilding, and are privileged to have with us the co-chairs of the IUCN's task force or thematic group, on rewilding, Professor Ian Convery and Dr. Steve Carver, who are joining us. Before I do hand over to them, I'll take this opportunity as CEO of WABSI, the West Australian Biodiversity Science Institute, to just tell you a few little things about us, who we are as an organisation. We're running this series, so this is the first, as I mentioned, of the series. The next event, which you'll get an invitation to as well, is on the 18th of August, looking at some work being done by the Danish Institute for Environmental Assessment on digitization in environmental assessment, and looking at front runners in global perspectives on that. And we're running these events in the lead up to a biodiversity conference to be hosted here in Perth and online in September this year. WABSI is a collaboration among 10 organizations. 4 of those are universities: Edith Cowan University, Curtin University, Murdoch University, and the University of Western Australia. We also have 4 government departments, state departments here in Western Australia with responsibility for land management or regulation. So Department of Water and Environment Regulation, Department of Mines, Department of Jobs, Tourism, Science and Innovation, Primary Industries and Regional Development, and the Department for Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions. Along with those 8 partners, we have Csiro, which is the Commonwealth's Science and Research Organisation, and the West Australian Museum. We work in that complex space that's all too familiar to conservation practitioners, where research, management, funding, communications policy, traditional values, opinions, land ownership, and all of those other things collide with the practice of biodiversity conservation. So we deal with those wicked problems and try and take an end-user-led approach to developing research that improves biodiversity science and improves biodiversity conservation for the state, and hopefully by sharing some of those lessons nationally and internationally, improves biodiversity conservation. So we have an approach where we are led by our end users to define what their knowledge needs are. We then work with our research participants to find where the answers to those questions might be, and then where questions still remain, develop research packages that address those outstanding questions and then work with the end users, the stakeholders, and the research community to implement those programs of research for biodiversity outcomes. So that's just a little taste for those that don't know about what WABSI, the West Australian Biodiversity Science Institute, is. And we produce a whole series of quite diverse reports, everything from working with subterranean cryptic fauna to feral cat issues, to working with some of the mining industry issues here in Western Australia around post-mining completion and restoration of the land, which is a good segue into today's topic in terms of restoration and rewilding. We're privileged to have, as I mentioned, the co-chairs of the IUCN's thematic group with us. Ian Convery is a professor of environment and society at the University of Cumbria in the UK, and his colleague Steve Carver is a senior lecturer at the University of Leeds, also in the UK. They bring a global perspective to the practice of conservation. They bring a diverse perspective, including a background in social science and geography, and not just the biological sciences that many of us are familiar with. So I look forward to a really interesting discussion today as we stand on the threshold of the UN's decade of restoration. It's timely to have our first seminar address this topic of rewilding, and pleasing to see it framed as an optimistic vision for biodiversity conservation. So without too much more, I will hand over to Ian and Steve.
Thanks very much, Owen. I'm currently experiencing a problem that many of you will be familiar with. I think my kids have been playing with the Wi-Fi settings. So it seems to cause problems when I'm screen sharing and have the video on. So I'll probably drop the video for the presentation if that's okay with everyone. But no great loss. It saves you from seeing my ugly mug for a wee while. So let me just start screen sharing. Hopefully you can all see that start slide. So yeah, thanks very much for inviting us to talk to you this morning. Just check that is actually off. All right. Okay. Yeah. Thanks very much for inviting us to talk to you this morning. As you've introduced, we're going to talk to you about restoration and rewilding, and highlight some of the work that we've been doing as part of the IUCN Commission for Ecosystem Management Rewilding Thematic Group. This is broadly what we're going to be talking about. There might be a few deviations along the way, but essentially talking through what rewilding is, what it isn't, say a little bit about the history of rewilding, talk about the rewilding family, I guess, in terms of the relationship between rewilding and restoration. Talk about the RTG and the rewilding principles which come out of that work, and then perhaps point towards some next steps for rewilding and also for our work too. Just before I start though, I really want to highlight the case that many of you will be familiar with. This is a group of Iranian cat conservationists who've been in prison since 2018. They were simply doing their job in the wrong place at the wrong time with camera traps. This could have been any of us on this call, I would imagine. It could easily have been Owen and myself in Kazakhstan. It could have been Steve in Iran. You know, there are many conservationists around the world who are attacked or imprisoned or even killed because of their work. They shouldn't be forgotten. Okay, on to rewilding. So rewilding seems to have been in the news quite a lot the last few years. This year we've had the first global Rewilding Day on the 20th of March. So it's very much kind of in the focus, I think. And of course, as Owen has said, we have the UN decade on ecosystem restoration. We've got a number of articles coming out of the Rewilding Thematic Group, not just linked to the Global Rewilding Day, of course, but we have a paper coming out in Conservation Biology, a big multi-author paper, which talks through the guiding principles for rewilding, which we'll introduce this morning. But as you can see probably from the list of authors there are many people who have been involved in rewilding for a very long time. People like Reid Noss, Michael Soule, Bill Ripple, etc. We've also got an IUCN Rewilding brief, which is coming out, which gives a more kind of policy focus on rewilding and the rewilding principles. We've got a piece coming out in the conversation, which is a sort of more newsy take on academic issues, and a paper which has just come out in British Wildlife. So there's a bunch of stuff coming out from us, at least, which talks to rewilding and the rewilding principles. And before we get on to what rewilding is, I think it's probably useful to talk about what rewilding isn't. There's a kind of bunch of fallacies out there about rewilding. So the most common one is it's about trying to create a past environment, perhaps an arbitrary environment from 5, 10, or 15,000 years ago. This absolutely isn't the case. It has to be necessarily forward-looking. Ecosystems are dynamic; they're constantly changing. We can't look backwards; we have to look forwards. It's about rewilding everywhere. Well, that's just stupid and impossible. We're always going to need food and other important commodities like timber and everything else. It can't be about rewilding everywhere. And another fallacy is that it's anti-farming. Well, again, in relation to the above point, then we're always going to need food, and we should celebrate the role that farmers have. It's anti-people. No, it's not. Rewilding nature and rewilding ourselves absolutely go hand in hand. And I think much of rewilding is about how we develop a different, more positive relationship with the natural world. It's only about bringing back predators such as wolves and bear. No. Species reintroductions can be an important part of rewilding, but it's got to be context specific, and it's got to be driven by science and ecosystem function. Okay, it does seem to have attracted some kind of interesting, controversial headlines in the media and the press, particularly in the UK context. So it'll be interesting to hear from you guys about how this plays out in Australia. It's often seen as a kind of controversial issue, particularly from the kind of conservative right and the farming community. So just a couple of recent headlines from the UK, one from the Spectator magazine, a photograph of a poster from Wales, put up by a bunch of farmers saying no to rewilding, which is in relation to one of the case studies I'm going to be talking through a bit later on. And my personal favourite is from the Daily Mash, which is a satire on carnivore reintroduction as part of rewilding, and they're talking about terminators being released into the Scottish Highlands. So on that suitably absurd note, I'm going to hand over to Steve to talk about what rewilding actually is.
Thanks, Ian. Yes, so let's move on. So I'll just, because Ian's got control of the slides, do forgive me, I'm just going to say next slide, Ian, when I want the next one, rather than flipping between our two screens, which would just take time. But don't go too far ahead at once, Ian. So back a couple.
Sorry, Steve.
Sorry, yeah. Just back to one, I think. Yeah, and then next slide. No, you've gone too far back. And next one. Excellent, leave it there. So yeah, we need to look at some of the origins of rewilding. And it first actually appeared in print, as best as we can find anyway, in an article in Newsweek magazine by Jennifer Foote. It was an article called Taking Back the World, or Taking Back the Planet, or something like that. And that was the first time that we can see the word actually in print. In 1993, Dave Foreman, one of the authors on that paper that we've got coming out in Conservation Biology, wrote about it in his articles around the campfire in Wild Earth magazine. And then, of course, we see in '98, we see the seminal paper by Michael Soule and Reed Noss, and they published this paper on rewilding and biodiversity in Wild Earth magazine, called Complementary Goals for Continental Conservation, in which they developed the original 3 Cs model of cores, corridors, and carnivores. In the meantime, we've got Dave Foreman's book looking at rewilding in North America. So this is the sort of 3 Cs model of core areas, connectivity between them, and the role of large carnivores in regulating ecosystems. I know Ian has just said that, you know, rewilding isn't just about large carnivores, but in some contexts it clearly is, because this connectivity and the core areas of wild land are fundamental nodes, if you like, in a sustainable view of large-scale conservation. Large animals need large areas, and they need to be able to move between them, hence the corridors. So next slide, in. So why rewilding then, if we move on? Well, the apocalypse is nigh. Many of you have probably seen this diagram. You know, we're currently clawing our way out of this COVID crisis. Depends where you are in the world as to where the wave is. And there's this little cartoon with the scientists saying, "Be sure to wash your hands and all will be well." But of course, those of us who are more forward-looking see some of the fallout of COVID being a global recession because of all of the impacts that it's had, but then the bigger waves following on are climate change. And then Mackay, who originally developed this cartoon, added later on biodiversity collapse. And then actually some wag on Twitter added a big red wave following on from this, which is labeled war. So there are a series of potential tsunamis about to wash upon our shore after COVID. And we perhaps need to address those. And so we'll be looking at how rewilding and restoration perhaps can shore up against some of these the greater impacts of climate change and biodiversity collapse. Next slide. Just recently, a couple of days ago, there was a paper came out on where we might find ecologically intact communities, and that was picked up by the newspapers, certainly in the UK here, which, you know, again, you know, another one of these kind of doom and gloom headlines. Just 3% of the world's ecosystems remain intact, the study suggests. Now, as a GIS geek, I often look at some of these global analyses which rely on global data sets with a little bit of cynicism, but I'm sure that the wider message is correct. Whether it's 3% or whether it's 10% or whether it's 0%, it doesn't really matter to some extent. You know, we are in a situation where we've massively impacted on the world's ecosystems. So next slide, in. So why rewilding then? Well, current conservation strategies, as good as and well-meaning as they are simply not sufficient. You know, the model of fortress conservation isn't working. The idea that we can put fences in some instances, or just a line on a map around an area and say this is a nature reserve, and it will exist in perpetuity there on its own, isolated in a sea of humanity, simply isn't working. We're in the middle of a species extinction crisis, and there's been a sharp decline. I don't need to tell you all this, but it's good background for what we're talking about here. A decline in abundance of wildlife. Many of those species is not recovered, or so rather are not covered by protected areas, and ecosystems continue to degrade, particularly even in areas which are protected areas and largely regarded as paper parks. Many of our protected areas are not big enough, they're not connected enough for fully functioning food webs, and the static boundaries that we place on them are artificial and do not accommodate change. So next slide, in. This is just a little slide which just shows the number of protected areas, almost exponential growth from 1900s to 2000 and beyond. Next slide. And that just, this slide here then just shows that, you know, some of the data on that sharp decline. So 60% decline across indicator species from 1970 to 2016. Really worrying figures here. And according to the IPBES, there are 1 million species which face extinction. Next slide, please. And most biodiversity is not covered by protected areas. So we see some data here from this paper here by Weston et al. In PLOS One. And if we look at that 35%, okay, that's the percent of all wildlife covered by protected areas. And of course, that just leaves 65%, which isn't. So next slide, please. And some nice graphics here, or some worrying graphics here. This Vaclav Silms looks at the Earth's land mammals by weight. So this is just mammals. It doesn't include amphibians and birds and the like. But the dark squares in the middle is us, and the cattle and our sheep and our other livestock all around, and the green blobs are wild animals. And there's a more data-driven paper here, Diaz et al., which just shows the change over time from 10,000 years ago to current time. It's been a transformative change in global ecosystems, especially when you think of all of the land which has been taken for livestock. Next slide, please, Ian. So we're in a situation here, as Owen said, as a time for a more optimistic approach to restoring nature, and one which promotes connectivity, coexistence, and the importance of core areas. So this is kind of our take on the 3 Cs model, which that cores, corridors, and carnivores. And we've messed around with it a little bit to create a Venn diagram where we're talking about cores, sure, fully functioning, fully occupied trophic ecosystems, i.e. retaining the wilderness areas that we have remaining on the planet, but then thinking about how those connect up in connectivity, but not just ecological and physical landscape connectivity, but also how people connect to those. And that overlaps into this notion of coexistence, the legal status of these areas, the acceptance of us as humans, of other wildlife, and our moral obligation to protect it, and mutual respect. And the overlaps between these circles in the Venn diagrams are interesting, because they talk about things like rewilding self and land sharing, protection and land sparing, but the ecological principles underpinning the cores, corridors, and carnivores model. And we'll come back to this idea that rewilding is nature-led and human-enabled in a few slides later on, and with a little bit of audience participation involved. But it's all sort of driven by scale, the levels at which we do this, the time scales required, and the diversity involved. So next slide, Ian. So
okay,
over to Ian.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So I'm going to take over and tell you a little bit more about the Rewilding Thematic group. This was set up in 2017, essentially to create a common basis for the development and understanding of rewilding globally, which is quite an ask, I guess, but also to provide SEM and IUCN with a clear understanding of rewilding and the opportunities that rewilding might present for conservation and where might fit into existing kind of SEM and IUCN activities, things like nature-based solutions, ecosystem goods and services, essentially. So in order to do that, we've done a bunch of work. We've carried out a systematic literature review. We surveyed rewilding pioneers and those involved in rewilding in the past, those involved in rewilding now, from a whole range of organizations and institutions and individuals. And on the basis of that work, we developed a set of guiding principles, which we then kind of took out on the road and tested at workshops in the US and in Europe and in China over the last couple of years. And on the basis of that, we produced the concept note, which is just coming out, and also the paper in conservation biology. One of the things that we've done as part of that work is to revise the 3 Cs approach, and as Steve said, we carnivores still have an incredibly important role to play in this, but we've tried to focus on coexistence as being perhaps a more contemporary take on what issues kind of need to be addressed as part of that work. So if you're interested in joining the Thematic group, you can find us on the SEM website, and you can also download the principles from that website and via the kind of various papers and other places that they're appearing as well. another plug for our paper. Our working definition of rewilding based on that work is that rewilding is essentially the process of rebuilding natural ecosystems following major, usually human disturbance, with an aim of creating a complete food web at all trophic levels and developing essentially a sustainable, resilient ecosystem using biota that would have been present had that disturbance not occurred. So this is about essentially a paradigm shift. We can't do this unless we have a paradigm shift in our attitude towards nature. And if we take that the goal of rewilding is the restoration of functioning native ecosystems complete with fully occupied trophic levels that are nature-led across a range of landscape scales, as Steve said a few slides ago, that invariably involves a role of predators in that system for some top-down regulation. Ultimately, rewilded ecosystems should be self-sustaining. They should require little to no human intervention management, whilst at the same time recognizing that ecosystems are dynamic. They're constantly changing. So I think I probably said much of what's on this slide already in terms of that kind of summary. I think a key point here is that they should be consistent as well with other approaches in the restoration rewilding family. So nature-based solutions, a CVD ecosystem approach, to some extent natural capital as well. And I guess it's important as well to recognize that even though I come across a little bit evangelical about rewilding at times, there aren't any simple solutions. These are wicked problems, they're complex problems, and they're spatially, temporally, ecologically specific. So we should question everything. And the interesting exchange in forest ecology and management recently about trophic cascade and the role of trophic cascade in Yellowstone, and some correspondence with Bill Ripple and others around this. So it's always important as a basic tenet of science to question all the time. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the rewilding principles as they are, and just kind of introduce them to you really. So firstly, rewilding utilizes wildlife to restore trophic interactions. This almost inevitably involves some translocation of highly interactive keystone species who are often apex predators. Rewilding should employ landscape scale planning that includes core areas, connectivity and coexistence. Connectivity for the free movement of species, of course, but coexistence of wild species and humans in an integrated kind of landscape approach. Local engagement and participatory planning is essential. You guys probably know this better than anybody in terms of your experience working with IPAs in Australia, but it's absolutely essential that we have local engagement in a meaningful way and participation in all stages essentially of project development. And it encourages, if nothing else, it encourages much better public understanding of wild nature and why it's important. And just, I guess, to kind of bang home this message, rewilding is not about recreating something from the past, but the role of reference ecosystems can be important in terms of informing future planning. Because with point 5 there, rewilding recognizes that ecosystems are dynamic, they're constantly changing, not least in relation to a whole bunch of future threats, which brings in principle 6, which is, of course, anticipating the impact of climate change. Principle 7, as we've talked through before, and Owen actually really expanded on this very eloquently at the start of the session, it's got to be informed by science and other forms of equally important forms of knowledge, indigenous and local knowledge as well. It's got to be about knowledge pluralism. Which ends up with a much better informed kind of system in an adaptive management framework, essentially. Rewilding, point 8, rewilding recognizes the intrinsic value of all species. So this is a kind of environmental conservation ethics question in many respects. It's got to be about the intrinsic value, the value of a species in and of itself, rather than just the instrumental value. The kind of the what's in it for us value, which is very much a kind of anthropocentric take on this. And this is part, I think, of this shift towards a more biocentric stroke ecocentric kind of worldview. It's got to be based on good science. Point 9, it's got to be adaptive, but dependent on monitoring and feedback. So, you know, good monitoring data gives us the ability to measure and compare efficacy within and across projects, essentially. And again, it's about this paradigm shift, which I think we would probably all see as being fundamentally important in terms of just having a different relationship with nature. So again, not to come over all evangelical about it, but I think it offers a more positive vision for the future. Okay, I think it's still me. So I'm going to talk through some rewilding examples. And often when Steve and I do these things, we get asked about rewilding projects and could we talk through some examples of rewilding projects? And that's often more difficult than it might seem, because some projects that rewild aren't called rewilding, and some projects that are called rewilding probably don't really do rewilding. But I'm going to try to talk through 3 examples from our IUCN briefing note that might shed a bit more light on this. So first, a good example of rewilding, I think, is the work of Conservation Patagonia, or Tompkins Conservation as it is now, in Patagonia, Chile. So this is the work of the Tompkins, who, as many of you know, made their money from North Face and Esprit, and then have ploughed it into conservation work. And their work in Chile, I think, just ticks many of the kind of rewilding boxes, certainly many of the rewilding principle boxes, because it's very much about connectivity, core areas, coexistence. It's about carnivores as well. It's about building trust with local communities. The land will eventually be handed back to the Chilean government to be managed as protected areas. It's large scale, it's multi-site, it's restoring plant and animal species. And the idea is that it will be functioning in time with limited or to no human intervention, except in the places where it offers some economic opportunity to local communities. So this is a really nice example of where rewilding works well. And most of the evidence that's coming through from Tompkins Conservation and their work in Chile is positive in terms of providing a foundation for other rewilding projects in South America. So that's the good. One of the things we asked to do with the briefing, though, was talk about rewilding projects that perhaps alienated a community. An example of this, a good example or a bad example, depending how you might look at it, is the Summit to Sea project, which was run by Rewilding Britain. So a key failing, I think, in rewilding and probably conservation generally is a failure to sufficiently and meaningfully engage with local communities. And, you know, this often just leads to alienation and project failure. And in this case, the project alienated the farming community because there hadn't been sufficient consultation and engagement, which led to a whole bunch of really negative headlines, bad publicity, alienated the farming community, and eventually Rewilding Britain had to pull out of the project, and it's continuing in a different form. So just a couple of newspaper headlines about that from the Financial Times, of all places, talking about how rewilding might need a rethink. So I think this is probably a great example of where certainly they failed on the principle 3, which is rewilding requires local engagement and support. Okay, the other example of in this case of rewilding that harmed biodiversity is, and I can never say this properly, so excuse me, I'm probably just going to say OVP, but it was Vaas de Plas in the Netherlands, a project which was set up in 1983, kind of through the work of essentially Frans Vera, who led the project. This is now I guess a notorious example of a rewilding project that failed to fully recognize ecological processes. There was insufficient connectivity within the project, insufficient herbivore regulation, which led to high herbivore mortality rates, particularly over winter. Some pretty damning headlines and public protests. So ending up with essentially reserves full of starving reintroduced animals, and some pretty negative press headlines. This is a cartoon from a Dutch newspaper saying, "Look, free nature," with a, as you can see, an image of starving and dead Henk horses. So this is an example of a rewilding project, I think, which certainly failed to meet Principle 1 and Principle 2 in terms of using wildlife to restore trophic interactions, but also that understanding or integration of core areas, connectivity and coexistence within the planning. Okay, I think that's my bit finished, and it's back to Steve for the quiz.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I've been to Australia a couple of times, but I didn't watch much television. So Ian tells me that the hard quiz is some cultural icon on Australian television. So I'll take his word for that. So next slide, Ian. But yeah, we've been asked to obviously talk to you about the interaction between restoration, ecosystem restoration, and rewilding. There's a little bit of a quiz here for you. I promised you some audience participation. So if you go to that link, and if you can multitask and in a different window as we go through this, then please do. I'll do it afterwards. I believe the slides are going to be shared, so no need to scribble this down. We're interested in this the interaction, or the overlap, if you like, between the relationships between restoration and rewilding. And if you follow any of the papers on, we'll come to this in a minute, but papers on rewilding and restoration, you'll know that there's quite a long-running debate as to whether rewilding is just restoration in some new clothes, sort of a King's New Clothes type model, or whether it is actually something different. So the next couple of slides, and if we go through these kind of slowly, Ian, are about options. So do you think that there is overlap between ecological restoration and rewilding? And this is option A. And so, restoration and rewilding share some, some basic principles. Or is it option B, which shows a much greater overlap? In fact, there's more commonality between the two concepts or two approaches of ecosystem restoration and rewilding. Or is it option C, that rewilding is entirely within the field of restoration? It just has some specific qualities which make it a little bit different. Or indeed, are they completely different things in option D? It's an or relationship. So is the thing that you're doing restoration, or is it rewilding? And I think we have an option E in, I can't remember.
I was just going to whiz back through the options again if people wanted to refresh for that.
Idea.
So yeah, so option A
would be sharing a slight bit of overlap between a small and. Option B is they're sharing a lot of commonality. Option C was that rewilding is entirely within restoration. It just has some unique attributes. And option D is they're completely different things. We did have an option E. The option E is the kind of the wild card that there's no such thing as rewilding. It's really just restoration with a new name. And this is what the Hayward et al. Paper was saying. Was saying that restoration is rewilding and wilding is restoration. So if we, oops, you're going forward too fast, Ian. Ecological restoration, it's really about returning ecosystems back to the way that they were before human disturbance. And okay, we've mentioned that in the rewilding principles, didn't we? But there are some differences. And if you think about reintroduction, and the IUCN has its own guiding principles on species reintroduction, it's about returning species back to where they used to live usually after humans have extirpated them for whatever reason, be that persecution or habitat loss or competition. Rewilding, it's about returning a managed, formerly managed area back to the wild. So this notion of rewilding being nature-led, human-enabled is actually quite important here. And it's humans allowing it to happen by stepping back and giving nature space and time to call the shots. In other words, being nature-led. Restoration, on the other hand, and I know this it's an imperfect model, but restoration I would see as being human-led but nature-enabled. So it's humans calling the shots, trying to restore ecosystems or reintroducing lost species or river restoration, whatever it happens to be, reforestation, but it's using natural processes to achieve those goals. Next slide, please, Ian. Oh, ignore the subliminal message. That's Ian trying to influence your opinion on this. So yeah, and as I say, I mentioned this Hayward paper. A lot of again another paper with a lot of authors on it. But we're basically, and people have responded to this, but it's basically saying that all rewilding is restoration, but not all restoration is rewilding. So we would say that rewilding projects emphasize and promote the autonomy of each ecological process. In other words, this nature-led approach, leading towards greater wildness. And it's understood that this is not necessarily in the absence of people, as Ian said right at the beginning, as to what rewilding isn't, but in terms of non-human agency. So rewilding is effectively a kind of a controlled decontrolling. So it's pulling back in a controlled manner to allow natural processes and wildlife and species to come back and start to reassert their own natural control on ecosystems where this is possible. And I say, accepting that it isn't possible everywhere, but just to promote the agency of non-human biophysical processes. So this more ecocentric approach. Next slide. And a lot of our work focuses around this diagram, which is actually originates from one of your fellow countrymen, a guy I had the pleasure of meeting once. He let me into the business class lounge when I bumped into him in where was it? I think it was Melbourne Airport. Rob Leslie, who sadly died a few years ago. And he talked about a continuum of human modification of wilderness ecosystems, and to create this diagram where you have a sort of a moving towards the right, you have increasing anthropogenic modification, towards the left, increasing ecological integrity and quality. And rewilding sits in this this continuum, this human modification spectrum, somewhere in the middle. I mean, we don't want to mess with pristine wilderness. That's, we just need to safeguard it. But we can, if where possible, move ecosystems further towards the right to be rewilded, more nature-led, human-enabled, and further to the left, in these more human-modified landscapes, allow, or rather intervene to remediate and to rehabilitate in a more restoration mode, human-led, nature-enabled. So going back to that box that Ian had up before about rewilding as being controlled, decontrolling. So next slide. So as I say, we see restoration as being human-led, nature-enabled. So human interventions dominate, and rewilding being nature-led, human-enabled, where natural processes dominate. The human role is about decoupling human management from natural systems and allowing natural processes to predominate. There's always a question there about, there's a lot of the justifications for rewilding are about ecosystem services and natural capital. And that comes back to some extent because these are human decisions about natural landscapes, come back to questions about what's in it for us. So yeah, there's some thoughts on that. So we move on, Ian, and how this sits within the the components of a wildland network, the cars, corridors, and in the center, compatible use between those linkages of farmed and human-dominated landscapes. And I think my next slide, my final one, is up next. Oh, Ian's been scribbling on it. Yeah, the compatible land use is the agriculture and the human settlements, etc. So back to this diagram of nature-led, human-enabled, our cause, connectivity, coexistence model, embedded within this continuum of human modification, just speaks to the fact that there is no one-size model fits all here. Rewilding needs to sit in this continuum in the appropriate places, and it is very context specific, and there are other sub-continuums going on in here about continuums of scale, continuums of level, and continuums of focus within rewilding. And I think Ian is going to finish off now.
Okay, I'm gonna risk turning my video on for the last few slides. We've got through most of it, so if we get system collapse now, I think we're probably okay. We're getting on to the summary, folks. You'd probably be pleased to know. But as one of the final slides, I want to talk about this cartoon by Robert Crum. Now, some of you might be familiar with Robert Crum's work. Often it's not for the faint-hearted. It can be vaguely pornographic, or actually just pornographic, I think. But in this cartoon, and he's part of that kind of counterculture 60s kind of movement in the US. So again, you probably know his stuff. But anyway, in this cartoon, what he does kind of really, it does a really interesting thing of tracing either the destruction of or loss of wild nature, or the progress of civilization, depending how you look at it in North America. So he talks about kind of the pre-European wilderness and American progress, and then development, and how all that speeds up in the late 19th, early 20th century, and through to the kind of conspicuous consumption of 40s, 50s, 60s America. But then what he does is a kind of really interesting thing in the bottom three frames. He starts to consider what next, what might come next, and whether we end up with a kind of ecological disaster, which is that frame on the left there. Do we come up with a techno fix to all these problems, or might we end up with some kind of ecotopian solution? And I guess these ideas are probably familiar to many of you because they also resonate with the work of Rod Nash and his classic book, kind of Wilderness and the American Mind, in terms of thinking through what next. But I would probably argue that if we want to avoid ecological disaster, and if we want to go somewhere towards the kind of ecotopian solution, then we again, to use this phrase, we need a paradigm shift in our relationship with nature. We have to move from being, to use a very familiar diagram, we need to be ecocentric, not just egocentric. We need to move from being anthropocentric to being much more ecocentric or biocentric in terms of how we look at who we are and what our place is in the world. So I think rewilding is absolutely part of this solution. And I think, as we start to work on the 3 C's approach and start to outline that more, along with the principles in the development of rewilding guidelines, I think we'll come back and say more about that in time, essentially. So I think that probably takes us to the end point. Steve's just reiterated this idea that there isn't a simple solution. I think if there was a simple solution to the biodiversity crisis, we would have probably found it by now. There's no magic bullet, there's no blueprint, but I think rewilding is absolutely part of the conservation toolkit and sits there alongside other approaches, whether that's ecosystem restoration, whether it's a nature-based solutions approach, whatever. I think it's absolutely there. So yeah, thanks very much for listening, folks, and I think we're open for questions.
Yes, thanks.
Thanks very much, both Ian and Steve, for what has been a very insightful and thought-provoking presentation. And absolutely, we're now moving into the phase of the presentation or the webinar where we will take some questions and hopefully open up some discussion. For those who haven't yet found it, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens or somewhere in the center, and you can type questions in there. What I'll try to do with those questions is summarize them or pull together any themes that emerge in the question. So you might not hear your question verbatim, but hopefully you'll hear the essence of it in the discussion. One point that came through earlier in the chat rather than the discussion, the question and answer stream, so you may not have seen it, Ian and Steve, was a comment about citizen science and the engagement with citizen scientists. Now, it alluded to some particular context here around permits and ethics, but I think it prompts a really important question on how as we move into this new phase or new paradigm, what is the role of the citizen scientist and the relationship between the citizen scientist and the professional restoration ecologist or rewilder?
You want to go with that one, Ian? Or?
Yeah, I'll go with that one. So I think this is a really interesting question. I think certainly in the UK context, it's something that we're kind of grappling with. It's very easy just to live or to work in a kind of bubble of like-minded people who care passionately about conservation and nature. And, you know, Steve and I talk about this at various places. We go to a festival every year where we talk about this. And I think it's the challenge is how we move these issues outside of our nice little kind of bubble of people who care about conservation into the mainstream. There aren't any easy answers to that. I mean, we run a project in the UK where we try to work with what I guess we'd call kind of more disadvantaged communities and get them involved in conservation work, and that's reasonably successful, I think. But all this kind of stuff takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of resource, but it's absolutely essential. So it's a really good question. I think it's fundamentally important that we get that level of engagement from a range of different communities, and citizen scientists got to be part of the mix. But it's something which takes a lot of work and effort to set up and to maintain.
Yeah, I mean, I just add that one of the things that we're doing in the UK, I don't know if it's something you're considering in Australia, is there's a move towards reinserting natural history into the school curriculum, and so we've lost that. A lot of the kids in the UK really don't know one plant from another. I didn't know what, couldn't identify bird species in the back garden. They're just burbs, as the kids call them here. But so getting that educational element back into the curriculum, which really introduces kids to wild nature early on, and makes them into citizen scientists, I guess, at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think just to very quickly add to that, we've just had a review carried out by the Treasury, so the financial arm of the UK government, by Pathira Dasgupta, a kind of world-renowned economist. And one of the key findings coming out of this report, which it's a Treasury report, is as Steve just said, we have to get nature into the school curriculum. So for that to come out of a Treasury report, I think is really interesting. And also he talks a lot about this relationship between humans and nature and how we need to have a change in that relationship. So it's not just a conversation or a discussion that's happening in the obvious places. It's a conversation, certainly in the UK context, that's happening in some places that maybe aren't so obvious. So the Treasury, financial institutions, etc. So it's starting to cross boundaries a little bit, which is important.
Yeah, I think the Dasgupta report is having impacts here in Western Australia as well. I was involved in some discussions earlier in the week where some of our industry stakeholders were alluding to the impact that it would have on their business models going forward, and referring to it in the same context as the Stern report, which also came out of that Treasury office and led to the IPCC climate change work. On the topic of climate change, we've had a few questions relating to climate change and non-stationary climate and how rewilding interacts with that fact that we're moving to a new climate norm, which may or may not be a stable new norm, or it may be a continuing direction, and maybe commenting on the relationship with climate change, rewilding, ecosystem function, and you did allude to it in your presentation, the fact that it's not a rearward looking, it's not a Pleistocene rewilding type approach.
Yeah, I think there's a number of issues that come to the fore here. One of the things is embedded within that connectivity element to both models there, in the connectivity that we need to re-establish between our core protected areas allows some north-south bottom-up migration of species. So as a little example, one of the rewilding sites in northwest UK, a place called Wild Ennerdale in the Lake District, I'm on the advisory panel for that, and we were sat on the top of one of the hills, and one of the ecologists with us, we were just having dinner, and he kind of looked down and goes, "Oh, you've got whatever it was, some dwarf willow right in the top of this mountain." And I just said, well, we ain't gonna have it for long, because some of these species are going to disappear off the tops of mountains in these isolated geographical islands. So connectivity is important at a continental and national scale to maintain that freedom of movement, to allow some of this north-south, east-west migration. The other issue is about, if you're planning rewilding projects which involve reintroductions, be that of animal, mammal, bird species or plant species, is which do you go for? And there's been some discussion, again, just using a UK example of, if you're planting trees or you're encouraging natural regeneration of trees, what species do you, because trees, have a long lifespan, of course. And so they're going to be living through a period of change. Do you go for more drought-resistant species, if we're thinking about there being, more droughty conditions in the future? Or, one example was we're constantly looking at this reintroduction of lynx to the UK and Eurasian lynx, but in southern Britain it might make more sense for it to be the Iberian lynx. These are just things that have been bandied around, but there's a couple of examples there of why we need rewilding to respond, but give it the flexibility in order to respond under its own steam effectively.
Yeah, and I think the other side of that is it's about having a much more joined up, integrated approach to what is essentially a bunch of wicked problems, not just one wicked problem. So, if rewilding is about thinking on a larger scale temporally and spatially, then planning ahead actually becomes even more difficult when you're trying to factor in things like climate change. And, good modeling is absolutely key to that. And I think we've made some really big advances in terms of how we can model future scenarios, and some of Steve's work's been really important for that, I think. But also, it comes back to policy and making very, very tough decisions in terms of where we spend our money. We've got finite resources to spend in conservation, and where does that money go? Do we focus on species that may survive in the short term, but may not survive in the longer term because they just haven't got the mobility to cope with climate change?
Okay. On a slightly different tangent, one comment that's come through is maybe a little around some academic navel gazing that happens in this space, and as one professor to another, and I'll have to take some of a hit on that as well. The whole discussion of what is rewilding versus what is restoration, versus what is ecosystem function, is it important? Is there a reason for the navel gazing, or should we just get on and improve biodiversity outcomes?
Yes to both, I think.
Yeah,
I mean, it's. Go on, Steve.
I don't want to carry on. I was just going to say there's a thing going around on Twitter, and in respect to this, you know, I tweet for my sins, and I know we promised we wouldn't swear on this thing, but there's one which is JFDI, just do it, and you know, and get on and do it, and anything, be it rehabilitation, remediation, restoration, or rewilding, I think at that kind of extreme on the right of the continuum diagram there, they're all kind of pushing things along from left to right, which is great. But, you know, there's a wider issue here about governance, public trust, meaning, which then takes you into semantics and things, you know, and if, and it was Tony Sinclair that said in a online seminar a few years ago, he said, if something, you know, thing, be it ecological restoration or rewilding, applies to everything, then it also means nothing. You know, so I think we do need to be careful, and yeah, okay, it might sound like navel gazing, but I think we do need to be careful about some of these terms and what they actually mean, in not just in principle, but in terms of action as well. You know, because we could end up tying ourselves in knots.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we're academics. You know, it's part of our job to make simple things complex. And so, and at its heart, rewilding is actually a pretty simple concept. It's just about restoring ecosystem function, so that, you know, that ecosystem is self-sustaining. It's self-willed, as one of our colleagues, Mark Fisher, would say. So it doesn't need all that ongoing human intervention and management plans and whatever else. So it's a reasonably simple idea at its heart, but yeah, that a lot gets written about simple ideas sometimes. And I think it's good just to come back to the sense that, look, as Steve just said, JFDI, there's some pretty basic, simple things that we could do now that doesn't often require a whole bunch of navel gazing. Yeah.
It's probably also to say that, you know, you can think about rewilding from a sort of a social movement perspective. It's also a social ecological movement perspective, and you can think about it as a thing, a doing thing. You know, it's got some ecological principles behind it, and that's what we've been trying to sort of reclaim, if you like, the ecological grounding foundations of rewilding in that paper for conservation biology, but accepting that it is a movement for many people.
And I think, you know, we talked at the start about working people like Michael Soule and Reed Noss and Dave Foreman, but who are, you know, fundamentally important, particularly in that US context. But in Europe, it probably started more of an activist thing with people like Peter Taylor and actually Mark Fisher as well. So I think we, you know, the activist roots are really important as part of that kind of rewilding picture.
So again, changing gear, a couple of questions around scale and some other issues. For example, rangelands, very large parts of Australia, native vegetation but grazed. Similarly, in North America, native grasslands that are grazed. What do you think, if any, is the role of rewilding in the context of productive native vegetation and native ecosystems?
Ooh.
Go on, Steve.
Go on, Ian, you were going to say something.
This is usually the bit where Steve and I look at each other and say we should have brought one of the ecologists from the Thematic group onto the call, because neither of us are ecologists. But I think it's you know, the get out of jail card on this one, I think, is it's looking at that specific context, looking at what's there now, looking at what's there in terms of the reference ecosystems, and then looking at the potential for that space to be wilder or rewilded as part of an integrated approach. So, you know, as Steve's just said, it doesn't make any sense to rewild everywhere. Why would you do that? But it does make sense to get connectivity in the landscape. So if working with that kind of landscape, if all you end up with is greater connectivity, that's fine, as long as you're looking at that as part of an integrated approach. Would be my take on it.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of grazing and rangeland ecology, you know, it takes us back. I know, you know, Garrett Harding's you know, views are a little bit unfashionable now for various reasons, but and fundamentally was correct with the tragedy of the commons. You know, it's an issue of scale and intensity in terms of, you know, grazing rangeland ecology. You know, too much livestock on a landscape can, you know, push it over the edge, a tipping point in terms of its ecology, and you end up with a very simplified, degraded, overgrazed landscape. Reducing the number of animals grazing a landscape then allows it a chance to recover. It may require a period of no grazing for that recovery to gain traction and that recovery process to re-establish itself. And again, I'm thinking about UK examples here because that's my direct personal experience. Then you can think about maybe reintroducing a grazing regime at a more sustainable level for the benefit of both the ecology and the grazing animals and the human benefits from that. A small example from the UK, again, you know, local to me, is a friend of mine bought a farm, a sheep farm up in the Yorkshire Dales, had 400 sheep on it and a few cattle, and he was losing money because of all of these fixed costs, the veterinary bills, the extra feed that was required, the fencing, the diesel, all of that stuff. And he did the sums and he said, if I reduce my flock by an order of magnitude, and he went from 400 sheep to 40, he started making money. Because all of his fixed costs are gone. No vet bills, no extra feed stuff's required, minimal fencing, you know, free range on his land, sorted.
And looking at that, sorry, Steve, have you finished?
No, I've finished.
Yeah, sorry. Looking at that globally, there's some really good examples of where, you know, for thousands of years, actually, rangelands have been managed sustainably with grazing regimes. So look at the Serengeti and the Maasai and grazing regimes there, which, you know, perhaps coming under more pressure now for a whole bunch of reasons, loss of rangeland, settled agriculture coming in, but for a long time, that's been a very sustainable system, which, to pick up again on Steve's Garrett Harding example, actually, often those systems and the management of those systems were invisible to colonists. So you look at the Gujameks who came in from Germany into the Serengeti, who said, you know, we should take all humans out of this environment. Well, actually, no, because that environment has emerged as a result of that grazing regime and that relationship between the Maasai and their livestock and wild nature as well. So it's you know, again, there isn't a simple solution. It's about looking at that place and looking at that place over a period of time to see what it has been like, and then start to think about what it could be like in the future, if change is required at all, I think.
That makes a nice link then to another stream of questions that are relating to if you could talk about any exemplars or situations you know of where there is engagement between First Nations peoples and rewilding around the world. Any concrete examples in that space?
Yeah, I thought I was muted there for a minute. My personal experience on that front has been in North America, in the Flathead Indian Reservation, and working with tribal people and local, you know, sort of incomer communities, a mixture of Jewish, Amish, and what we might call sort of redneck American backwards communities at the interface between intensive farming in the plains and wilderness core areas in the mountains. So looking in this buffer zone, and you know, there we were trying to unpick the values and the meanings attached to that particular landscape between these different community groups, and identify areas of conflict and areas of possible coincidence of ideas. And it's about, I think about again, connectivity, but connectedness of the people to the landscape. And what we were finding there in that particular project is that the indigenous community were very much connected to the landscape at an basic ecological level that the other incoming communities simply didn't have. And that raises some problematic issues in terms of rewilding and restoration and the relationships between humans and landscapes. Particularly for, I guess, sort of white Western European cultures, parachuted into existing landscapes, as Ian was describing there, the Serengeti as an example. And I think, it's a difficult one. I guess, Ian, you've got more experience in other locations.
I suppose, well, I guess it's thinking about, the word rewilding itself, which probably has little to no meaning to many indigenous peoples anyway, because it just doesn't fit with their worldview. So often what we talk about in this kind of context is that the relationship to local communities, which sometimes involves indigenous communities, but not always. So the Tompkins conservation example that I gave before actually is probably a nice example of where that organization spent a long time building trust with local communities in terms of the changes that they were planning and the opportunities that those changes could give to those communities in terms of ecotourism and various other ways as well. So I think it's not an easy thing to do. It takes a lot of time to build that kind of trust. But if we talk truly about kind of indigenous communities, rewilding probably has no meaning whatsoever in terms of how they see themselves in the world and their relationship to nature. And actually, you guys can probably talk to us about this in a much more meaningful way in terms of some of the IPA interventions in Australia, which I think are really interesting.
Another theme to pull a few strands of questions together is this notion of moving from human-led, nature-enabled restoration to human-enabled, nature-led rewilding, which presents a question then of the role of humans in the endpoint.
Yeah, as I said, introduce that model. It's definitely an imperfect one, but it kind of talks to the difference between restoration and rewilding. The role of humans is, you can't take humans out of the equation. I've got a friend that I've not actually met yet, but we talk a lot on Twitter and email. Ginny Bateson in the UK, and she's pushing this idea of fluminism. I don't really fully understand it yet, but it's basically saying, humans, we're part of the natural system. We are animals, we're carbon-based life forms. And you can't take humans out of the equation at this level because of a whole bunch of reasons. We're part of the process, we're part of the ecosystem. It's rather that level at which we exert our dominance and control. And rewilding is having the courage and the humility to step back a little bit and say, well, you know what, nature can, has a role in certain ecosystems, certain landscapes, at different scales, at different levels, and just having the courage to allow it to call the shots, I guess. And I see Ian's itching to say something.
No, I'll just scribbling some stuff down as you're speaking, because I was thinking about nature needs half as well. But that slide that you kind of had on a few minutes ago, Steve, with Earth's land mammals by weight, and whatever it is, 96% of Earth's land mammals by weight are it's us, or it's our livestock. I mean, that's a pretty incredible statistic, I think. So, what does that mean in terms of human role involvement? Yeah, I think it's, in some cases, it's stepping back. But if we look at the nature needs half movement, and then really start to kind of look at that and think about, well, what does that mean in practice? If we're going to give half of the planet to nature, does that mean that there's no human role in those areas? Is there limited human role? Do those areas become protected areas? If they become protected areas, then what kind of protected areas? So I think there's, it's a really, well, we've used the word wicked problem quite a lot today, but I think it's a really tricky problem, isn't it, in terms of how you negotiate that space, and what's the human presence look like in those places going forward.
Well, I think it's probably an issue of different relationship with the land. I quite often hear this, people profit planet thing, and that puts humans at the top. The primacy of the human. And I quite often say, well, no, you kind of got that the wrong way around. It's planet, people, profit. No planet, no people, no profit. And so I think, in rewilding examples and projects, the relationship between people and the land is changed to an extent that instead of it being, the land is there to exploit, to generate that profit, it might through farming or mining or drilling for oil or whatever it happens to be, logging. The role of the human is more of a custodian, a steward, and in promoting ecological processes, but wider benefits elsewhere. So the nature-based solutions approach, there are a lot of ecosystem service delivery models which have wild areas at the heart of them, and obviously the simple ones are about water supply, clean water supply, things like that, carbon sequestration, carbon storage, nutrient supply, nutrient cycle. All of these things rely on natural processes, and there's an argument to say that in wild or rewilded landscapes, those are coming not necessarily for free, but at a lower cost, and delivering those benefits to people living elsewhere. And there are economic models where instead of farming or extractive land uses, it's okay. The easy one's ecotourism, but I think it's more than that in terms of securing nature-based solutions and services in the wider landscape.
I think the challenge or the problem potentially with those kinds of approaches, I mean, nature-based solutions to some extent, but natural capital particularly, I think, is that we just end up with a very reductionist take on value and the value of nature. And, we don't really address this problem of how we become less anthropocentric and more ecocentric, because what we potentially end up with is just focusing on what nature does for us. And, that instrumental value rather than just the intrinsic value of nature. So I have a bit of an issue, I think, with particularly natural capital. I mean, I think it's a step in the right direction in many ways, but I see some potential flaws with it. But I guess what it does, and as Steve's just kind of said as well, everything sits with it in the 5 capitals model. Everything sits within natural capital. So human capital, social capital, manufacturing capital, financial capital, whatever, all that stuff is within natural capital. So, what that's saying, of course, is that it can't exist. All the human stuff can't exist without nature. So that at least I think is important, and that's at the heart again of the Dasgupta review, this kind of natural capital approach.
Yeah, it is, and Dasgupta actually sort of brought capitalism back into the wider planet, people, profit model rather than people, profit, planet.
Yep. Okay, a question which has been highlighted by our audience participants. So what are your thoughts on the role of bringing back extinct species in the context of rewilding?
Well,
go?
Yeah. You mean extinct locally or extinct globally?
Well, I think you need to give that some context, Steve. I'm still on the spot.
Well, I guess, yeah. I mean, there's species which have been made extinct locally, but still exist elsewhere, then that's a relatively easy gain. Oh yeah, there's still all of the problems that we've been talking about, but bringing back you know, species which have been made extinct and obviously are oh, how do you say it, thylacine?
Thylacine, yeah.
Tasmanian tiger.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, it's nice to think that there may be still some hanging around out there, and there's a lot of. There was a video recently which turned out to be a possum or something. I can't remember, or a wallaby or whatever it was. I can't remember what the video was showing, but it wasn't a Tasmanian tiger. But if indeed they are extinct, and there is even the vaguest possibility of bringing them back through, you know, Jurassic Park style genetic, you know, engineering, then I don't know. There's a big moral argument to be had there. I don't see it as being. I see it as being a bit of a distraction, personally. But if it's locally extinct and globally still existing, I don't see any problem at all. Barring
I mean, I'd go along with that. I think that kind of the extirpation locally of a species that had been there in the past, I think is pretty straightforward. I mean, depending on how long it's been missing from that landscape, it's a reasonably straightforward process. And, you know, there's IUCN guidelines on translocations. There's a whole bunch of evidence and science to guide that process. And it becomes trickier if they've been away for longer. You know, so lynx in the UK have been away for 1,300 years. It's quite a long time. Is it sensible to talk about a reintroduction there? So if a species has been missing perhaps for a couple of 100 years, 50 years, whatever, then it's usually more straightforward. So I think extirpations are one thing. That bringing back extinct species, I mean, the science is fascinating, I think. But, you know, I talked before about a world of finite resources to spend on conservation and nature. And, you know, are we getting good bang for our buck if we're trying to bring back woolly mammoths when that money could have been spelt elsewhere? I love the idea that it could happen. I don't think that it's a sensible use of resources at this point in time, though the science is fascinating.
Yeah.
What are we bringing them back to? Go on, Steve, sorry.
I was going to say, the other thing with some reintroductions is that they're forever going to be behind fences. You know, there's a project or various projects around Europe where large grazing herbivores have been reintroduced, but they're being reintroduced into enclosures because, you know, they are essentially dangerous animals, you know, very large dangerous animals like European bison, the Vesant, and to introduce those as a free roaming animal into the wider human-dominated landscape is only going to result in conflict and you know, sometimes dangerous conflict, and so they're forever going to be behind fences. And so there's a sort of interesting ethical moral argument to be had there. Are we just creating large-scale zoos? And with the zoo laws, you can't have predator and prey in the same enclosure. So the opportunities for, you know, creating even if these are large-scale enclosures, you know, truly natural ecosystems is limited. And that was the problem with Oostvaardersplassen, this place in the Netherlands. It's just simply too small, and there was a fence around it, and the animals couldn't migrate in the winter to find fresh browse. Simple as.
You pronounced that much better than I did. You should do that slide in future.
Excellent. Well, it only remains for me to thank our panelists once again. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Steve, for your very informative presentation and willingness to discuss the thorny issues and take on some challenging questions. In closing, I do want to again remind people that this is the first of a series of seminars. The next one being presented by Danish Environmental Assessment Institute on their DREAMS project, looking at digital information in environmental assessment, so digital tools in our discipline area, and looking at some global front runners in that space. Another plug for the Biodiversity Conference here in Perth in September, also available virtually for those who are not here in Perth. and can't travel. Thank you everyone for your participation. At the end of the Zoom link, there will be the opportunity to respond to a questionnaire to give us some feedback. You'll also receive that by email. We'd really appreciate that feedback on the sorts of topics and how useful you found today's presentation. So with that, I will wrap up and thank you all.
Thanks all.
Cheers, guys.
Yeah, bye.